The war was almost over, though no one dared say it out loud. In April 1945, a group of German teenage soldiers, Hitlerjugend, barely 17, huddled in the ruins of a village near Kassel. Smoke still rose from the thatched roofs. The streets were a mess of broken wagons, glass, and the silent outlines of lives that had burned away overnight. For weeks, these boys had been fighting ghosts, invisible artillery, unseen planes, an enemy that seemed to appear from the clouds. They'd been told the Americans were monsters, ruthless, mechanical, and eager to destroy every trace of Germany. They believed it. They had to. That morning, when the sound of engines rolled across the hills, they expected tanks. They took their positions behind a crumbling stone wall, clutching rifles too heavy for their hands. But when the first vehicle crested the hill, it wasn't a tank. It was a jeep, white markings on the hood, a red cross shining in the morning light. Behind it came a truck, also marked with crosses, its rear doors open. Inside, men in khaki uniforms moved quickly, carrying stretchers. The German boys watched, confused. The medics weren't armed. No helmets, no rifles. Just armbands and bandages. Then came the sound that froze them all, a child crying. From the wreckage of a nearby farmhouse, two small figures stumbled out, a girl and a boy, their faces gray with dust, their clothes torn. The girl couldn't have been more than 6. She was dragging her brother by the arm. One of the medics ran toward them immediately. "Don't shoot!" one of the German teenagers hissed to his comrades. But none of them moved. They could only stare as the American knelt in the mud, checking the children for wounds, shouting something to his partner for morphine and blankets. Within minutes, more medics joined him. They lifted the children onto a stretcher and carried them to the truck, with the same care they might have given their own. The German commander, a 19-year-old corporal named Dieter Weiss, felt his throat tighten. "They're helping them?" he whispered. He didn't understand. Those were German children. Enemy children. And the Americans had stopped their advance, risked their lives, even, to save them. It was the first time Dieter began to wonder whether everything he'd been told about the enemy was a lie. For the first time in months, no one knew what to do. The American column halted just outside the village, engines idling while the medics worked. From behind their ruined wall, the German teenagers waited for an order that didn't come. Their corporal, Dieter Weiss, watched through a pair of cracked field glasses as the scene unfolded like something from another world. The medics wrapped the children in blankets, lifted them gently into the back of the truck, and began cleaning their wounds. One soldier, a tall man with a southern accent Dieter couldn't understand, handed the little girl a tin of chocolate powder, the kind they'd only heard of in ration rumors. The boy, still shaking, clutched a wool glove someone had given him. The Americans moved calmly, almost tenderly, in the middle of what should have been enemy territory. No one pointed a rifle. No one barked orders. One of the younger Germans, Franz, whispered, "Should we shoot? They're in the open." But his voice trembled. He didn't want to. None of them did. Dieter lowered his binoculars. The boy inside him, the one who believed in heroism and fatherland, was quiet now. The soldiers beside him weren't warriors. They were children pretending to be. They were starving, exhausted, lost in uniforms too big for their shoulders. "They're medics," Dieter said finally. "Shooting them wouldn't be war. It would be murder." The words felt dangerous to speak aloud. But no one argued. Down below, one of the American officers glanced toward their hiding spot. He didn't raise his gun. He just waved. A simple, almost casual gesture, and shouted something they didn't catch. Moments later, the convoy began to move again. The trucks rolled slowly through the village, leaving only tire tracks in the mud and a silence that seemed to swallow the air. Dieter stood motionless. He could still see the image in his mind, the medic's hand resting on the little girl's hair, brushing it back from her face before lifting her into safety. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't propaganda. It was human. And somehow, that scared him more than the sound of artillery ever had. That night, when darkness fell and the boys huddled in their makeshift shelter, None of them spoke for a long time. Then Franz finally asked, "Do you think they would have helped us too?" Dieter didn't answer. He didn't have to. Because deep down, he already knew. At dawn, the fog hung low over the valley, turning the wrecked farmhouses into pale silhouettes. The boys hadn't slept much. Every creak of the rafters sounded like an engine. Every gust of wind made them flinch. But the Americans hadn't returned. Only the crows had. By morning, Dieter decided they needed food. The ration tins were empty, just a smear of grease and 2 stale biscuits left. So he and Franz crept toward the cluster of houses at the edge of the village. The first one they entered smelled of smoke and disinfectant. Inside, white bedsheets hung from the ceiling, pinned like makeshift curtains. The furniture had been pushed aside, leaving a narrow path through the room. On the table lay bandages, bottles of iodine, and a pair of blood-stained scissors. "This was a hospital," Franz murmured, his voice echoing softly in the cold. Dieter nodded. The sheets moved gently with the draft, ghost-like. He stepped closer and noticed something on one of the tables, a folded armband with a red cross drawn in faded paint. An American helmet rested beside it. He picked it up. Inside, written in smudged pencil, were 3 words. "For the living ones." Before he could think about what it meant, the door creaked open behind them. Both boys froze. A figure stepped inside, an old woman in a gray coat, her eyes sharp but not afraid. She looked at their uniforms and sighed. "You're too young to die for them," she said simply. They didn't answer. She motioned toward the stove. "If you came for food, there's soup left. The soldiers who were here, Americans, fed everyone, even the ones in uniform. Then they left." Dieter hesitated, unsure whether this was a trap or mercy. The smell of boiled potatoes decided for him. They ate in silence while the woman watched, her hands folded over her apron. Outside, sunlight pierced the fog, lighting up the fluttering white sheets. They looked like surrender flags now. When they finished, she said, "They said they don't fight boys. Only men who've forgotten they were children once." Her words struck something deep. Dieter stood, thanked her awkwardly, and stepped back into the daylight. The village seemed changed, less ruined somehow. Or maybe he was seeing it differently. He turned to Franz. "Maybe we've all forgotten," he said. Franz frowned. "Forgotten what?" "How to be human." By afternoon, the mist had thinned, leaving behind a heavy, windless quiet. The 2 boys followed a dirt path that wound between shell-pocked walls and broken fences. They didn't speak. Dieter kept replaying the woman's words in his head. They fed everyone, even the ones in uniform. Franz, still suspicious, kicked at a stone. "It's propaganda," he muttered. "They do it to look good. They want us to think they're merciful." "Maybe," Dieter said softly, but his voice lacked conviction. They stopped near a ditch filled with shattered helmets and the burned skeleton of a truck. Among the debris lay a dead soldier, not German, not American either, just unrecognizable. His uniform was covered in dust, his hands frozen in a strange half-open gesture, as if still reaching for something. Dieter crouched beside him, scanning for insignia. He found none. Only a small satchel hung from the man's shoulder, its strap half-burned. Inside, amid scraps of rations and a dented compass, was a folded piece of paper. He opened it carefully. The edges were blackened from fire. In faint, smudged English, he made out the words. It found, "Please tell my wife that I tried to help the children. I didn't fire. I only wanted to carry them." Dieter blinked. For a moment, the noise of war faded completely. He could almost see the scene, the man kneeling amid gunfire, trying to lift a child, perhaps the same age he'd been when the bombs first fell on Cologne. He handed the letter to Franz, who read it twice, his lips moving silently. Then he shoved it back into the satchel, as if it burned his fingers. "You don't know if it's true," he said quickly. "Maybe he was lying." Dieter looked at him. "Does it matter?" Franz turned away, staring at the horizon. "It should." They stood there for a long moment, the wind tugging at their torn uniforms. Dieter tucked the letter into his coat pocket. He didn't know why, only that it felt wrong to leave it behind. As they continued down the road, the clouds broke open, letting sunlight spill over the fields where the fighting had passed. The land was scarred, but in places, small shoots of green were pushing through the ash. Franz noticed them first. "Spring," he muttered. "Even after all this." Dieter didn't answer. His hand brushed the letter again through the fabric of his coat. "I only wanted to carry them." The words looped in his head like a ghost refusing to fade. He didn't know it yet, but by nightfall, that sentence would no longer feel like something written by a stranger. The sun dipped behind the hills, setting the broken landscape aflame with amber light. The boys were still walking when they heard it, faint at first, like the whimper of a wounded animal. Franz froze. "You heard that?" Dieter nodded, his body tensing. Another sound followed, a muffled cry, unmistakably human. It came from the direction of a ruined orchard a few hundred meters off the road. They crept closer, rifles raised more out of habit than intent. The orchard was a ruin, twisted trees, shattered fences, and a scorched farmhouse at its center. Near the collapsed barn door, they found the source, two small children huddled beside a wagon, wrapped in a torn blanket. One was a girl, maybe 6 years old, the other, a boy no older than 4. Both were filthy, their faces streaked with soot. The boy's arm was bandaged with what looked like part of a shirt, now soaked through with blood. Franz's instinctive scowl softened into confusion. "They're German?" he whispered. Dieter crouched. "I think so." He spoke gently in their language. "Where are your parents?" The girl didn't answer, only stared at him with wide, tearless eyes. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She was trembling violently. Franz muttered, "We can't stay. If patrols find us with civilians, then they'll help." Dieter cut him off. "We can't leave them like this." "Help?" Franz scoffed. "You think anyone helps children anymore?" Before Dieter could reply, a rumble echoed in the distance. Engines. American. The sound was growing louder. The children stiffened in terror. The girl clutched her brother and whispered a single word. "Yankees." Dieter looked toward the road, where dust clouds marked the approach of a convoy. He turned to Franz. "If they see us armed, they'll shoot first. We need to wave them down, show we're not a threat." Franz's face twisted. "You've lost your mind." Dieter didn't answer. He pulled the rifle's bolt open, ejecting the cartridge, and laid it in the dirt. Then he stood, hands raised, as the convoy came into view, olive trucks, white stars painted on their sides, headlights dim in the evening haze. A jeep pulled ahead, its machine guns swiveling toward them. Someone shouted through a megaphone, English, fast and sharp. Dieter couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear, "Don't move." The first American soldier to step out wasn't aiming. He was young, maybe 19, with dirt on his face and a Red Cross armband. A medic. He looked at the children, then back at Dieter and Franz. His voice softened. "You found them?" Dieter nodded slowly. The medic hesitated only a moment before kneeling beside the kids, checking the boy's arm. "We'll take them," he said, his accent thick but kind. Franz's jaw clenched. "They're enemy children." The medic's eyes flicked up, weary but firm. "Not tonight, they're not." For the first time in months, Dieter felt something crack open inside him. Not fear, not relief, but something harder to name. It wasn't victory or surrender. It was the faint, dizzying sense that maybe the war hadn't stolen everything. The Americans moved quickly, their precision startling to the boys who had grown up on order and discipline. Yet this was different, not the cold efficiency of a drill, but something human, urgent and calm. The medic, whose name tag read, Corporal R. Miller, barked short instructions in English to two soldiers carrying stretchers. Within seconds, a small triage station was unfolding on the back of a truck. Clean bandages, canteens, and tins of salve appeared like magic from canvas pouches. Franz and Dieter stood a few meters away, uncertain whether to stay or flee. Their rifles lay forgotten near a tree. Miller glanced back at them as he worked, dabbing the boy's arm with something that smelled sharp and sterile. The boy whimpered. The medic spoke softly, soothingly, though the words were foreign, the tone was unmistakable. Dieter knelt closer, his curiosity overpowering his fear. "You help them?" he asked in halting English. Miller looked up, his blue eyes narrowing slightly before his face softened. "Yes. We help." Franz let out a sharp laugh, not mocking, but incredulous. "Help the enemy?" he muttered in German. "They'll shoot us when they're done playing nurse." But the medic didn't reach for a gun. Instead, he tore open a packet of crackers and handed one to the girl. She stared at it, unsure what to do, before biting incautiously. Her shoulders relaxed at the taste. Dieter felt heat rise to his face. You treat everyone?" Miller hesitated. He gestured toward his Red Cross and said, "Wounded are wounded." Then, after a pause, he added more quietly, "War doesn't matter when someone's bleeding." The words hit Dieter like a blow. He'd been taught since childhood that mercy was weakness, that compassion for the enemy was treason. And yet, in front of him, an American was proving the opposite, that kindness was strength. Franz turned away, muttering under his breath, but Dieter kept watching as the medics cleaned the children, wrapped them in wool blankets, and gave them warm water to drink. When Miller finished, he looked up again, studying the two teenage soldiers. "You boys," he said slowly, searching for words. "You come with us. Camp, food safe." Franz's instincts screamed no. But Dieter saw the children, now sleeping in the truck bed, and something inside him refused to turn away. "Okay," he whispered. And that's how two teenage soldiers, who'd been taught that mercy was a lie, found themselves following a convoy of Americans who saved the children they couldn't. As they climbed onto the truck, Miller tossed a blanket toward them. "Cold tonight," he said. "You'll need it." The fabric smelled faintly of soap and medicine. For the first time since the war began, Dieter realized he wasn't shivering from fear, but from something dangerously close to hope. By the time the convoy reached the American field camp, the night had deepened into a hush broken only by the crunch of boots and the rattle of engines cooling down. The camp glowed faintly beneath stringed lights, an island of order and warmth in a world of ruin. Dieter and Franz followed the medics past rows of canvas tents. The air smelled of diesel, coffee, and something else that made their stomachs ache, freshly baked bread. A mess sergeant waved them toward a bench near a fire pit, gesturing that they sit. Within minutes, tin plates appeared in their hands, a thick slice of bread, a ladle of stew, and a steaming mug of something dark and sweet. Franz stared down at it, stunned. This for us?" The sergeant just grinned, wiping his hands on a towel. "Eat. No trouble." Dieter took a cautious bite. The bread was soft, impossibly soft, and the stew rich with chunks of meat and potatoes. It was nothing like the thin, sour rations they'd eaten for months. For the first time in a long while, he didn't have to force himself to swallow. Around them, the camp was alive with laughter. American soldiers leaned back in folding chairs, trading jokes, sharing cigarettes, listening to faint jazz from a radio balanced on a crate. The ease of it all felt alien. Franz muttered, "They're acting like the war's over." Dieter shook his head slowly. "Maybe for them it is." They watched as Miller, the medic, emerged from a nearby tent, now without his gloves or helmet. He caught their gaze and walked over, carrying a small loaf of bread wrapped in cloth. "Kids asleep," he said. "You did good finding them." Franz looked away. "We didn't do anything." The medic smiled faintly. "You didn't leave them." That sentence hung in the air, heavier than it sounded. Dieter felt it land somewhere deep inside, that mercy didn't have to be grand. Sometimes, it was simply not leaving. He noticed the Americans sharing their food freely, passing cups, laughing with the same open ease no German camp ever allowed. Even the officers joined in, their tone casual, their posture relaxed. It was a kind of equality Dieter had never seen. After dinner, A soldier brought a tray of sliced apples and candy bars. "Chocolate?" he asked, waving one toward them. Franz blinked. "Chocolate?" He hadn't seen real chocolate since before the bombings. The soldier tore one in half and offered the piece. For a moment, Franz hesitated. Then he accepted, biting in carefully. His eyes widened, and he let out a small laugh, unguarded, almost boyish. Miller chuckled. "Told you," he said. "Best medicine in camp." The group laughed, and Dieter joined in, quietly at first, then freely. In that instant, surrounded by strangers who had every reason to hate him but didn't, Dieter realized how starved he'd been, not just for food, but for humanity. Morning came slowly to the camp, slipping through the mist that hung over the tents. A bugle called in the distance, but it sounded more like a song than a command. The Germans, Dieter, Franz, and the two rescued children, were given a place near the medical tents, close enough to be watched, but not confined. For the first time since the war began, Dieter woke to the smell of coffee instead of smoke. Miller was already moving between cots, checking bandages, laughing softly with the other medics. When he noticed Dieter awake, he nodded toward a tin cup. "Drink. Hot." Dieter took it with both hands, savoring the warmth. It wasn't just the drink, it was the feeling of being treated as human. Franz sat nearby, sharpening a stick with his pocket knife, pretending not to care. "Don't get used to it," he muttered. "They'll ship us somewhere soon. Back to the real world." But even he couldn't hide the way his eyes softened when the little girl from the night before approached, her arm bandaged neatly, holding half a roll of bread she must have saved from breakfast. She offered it to him shyly. He blinked, confused. "For me?" She nodded. Franz took it, his lips parting in an awkward smile. It was the first time Dieter had seen him smile in months. Then, something unusual happened. One of the American sergeants walked through the camp calling names, holding a stack of envelopes. Mail delivery day. Soldiers crowded around, cheering, laughing, groaning at the news from home. Miller received a letter and read it quietly beside Dieter. He didn't hide the contents. "From my wife," he said simply. "She says the baby's walking now." Dieter tried to imagine it, life moving forward somewhere far away, while here, in the wreckage of everything he knew, time still felt frozen. He hesitated, then asked, "You tell her about us?" Miller grinned. "Maybe I will." Picked up a couple German kids and 2 boys with more questions than bullets. "She'd like that." Franz chuckled under his breath. "You think your wife cares about Germans?" Miller's tone didn't change. "She cares about people." That answer silenced Franz. As the morning faded into day, the soldiers gathered to listen to the radio. A broadcast announced Allied advances in Europe. Maps were being redrawn, the world tilting. But for the first time, Dieter didn't feel the need to know who was winning. He only knew that someone, somewhere, still wrote letters about babies learning to walk, and that meant the world could heal, piece by piece. He looked down at the little girl now asleep beside the fire, her small hand clutching his sleeve, and realized that maybe he'd already begun to change sides in a way that had nothing to do with uniforms. The fragile calm of the camp didn't last. 3 days later, the spell broke with the sound of approaching trucks and the clipped voices of American officers. Papers were exchanged, orders were read, and suddenly everything that had felt steady began to shift again. Franz noticed first. "They're moving us," he said, watching soldiers pack crates and roll maps. "You see? I told you. They were never going to keep us here." Dieter frowned. "Maybe just to another camp. Or back to Europe," Franz replied, his tone hard. "And when we get there, don't expect bread and blankets." Their fears proved half true. The Americans weren't sending them home, but consolidating prisoners from across the islands. Miller found them by the mess tent, his face unreadable. "Orders came through," he said. "We're transferring north. You'll be processed at the main camp, safer there." He hesitated, then added, "The kids too." The little girl clung to his leg, refusing to let go. "Don't make us go," she whispered in German, which Miller didn't understand, but he didn't need to. Dieter felt something twist in his chest. Can't they stay with you? Miller shook his head. Not my choice, son. None of this is. That phrase, none of this is our choice, stayed with Dieter the whole afternoon as they packed. It was strange hearing the enemy sound defeated, not in battle, but in spirit. Before they left, Miller crouched beside the children, giving them each a small cloth doll made from medical gauze and buttons. Lucky charms, he said, smiling. Keep them close. Then he turned to Dieter and Franz, pressing something else into their hands, 2 envelopes, unsealed. Inside each was a short note written in rough German. You're not what they said you were. Remember that. Miller. Franz stared at the paper as if it were a weapon. What's this supposed to mean? Dieter folded his carefully and slipped it into his jacket. It means someone saw us, he said quietly. When the convoy rolled out, the children waved through the back flap of the truck, the dolls clutched tight in their hands. The medics stood in the distance, shadows against the rising sun. Franz muttered, Strange people. They fight with bombs and feed with bread. Dieter looked back one last time. Maybe that's why they're winning. The journey north was long and silent. The trucks bounced over rough terrain, past jungle clearings scarred by craters and rusting wreckage. Every mile was a reminder of the war's reach, and of how far from home they truly were. The American guards weren't cruel, but they were firm. No talking out of turn, no wandering. They shared rations, though, and even gave the children extra when they asked politely. As the convoy stopped near a broken bridge for repairs, Dieter watched one of the guards, a man named Thomas, offering water to a wounded Japanese POW being transported in another truck. It stopped him cold. Why? He asked. He's your enemy. Thomas shrugged. He's thirsty. That simple answer echoed what Miller had said days earlier, and again Dieter felt the slow, confusing warmth of realization spreading through him. Maybe this wasn't weakness. Maybe mercy was its own kind of victory. When they arrived at the main camp, rows of white tents stretched into the horizon. A flag flapped lazily in the sea wind. The guards lined them up, registered their names, and divided them by age and skill. The children were taken to the infirmary. Dieter tried not to panic as they were led away, but the girl turned once and smiled, holding up the gauze doll. He smiled back, though his throat ached. That night, under a vast Pacific sky, Dieter lay awake listening to waves crash against the shore. Around him, other prisoners whispered about escape, about Germany, about rumors of surrender. But Dieter only thought of Miller's note. You're not what they said you were. He turned it over and over in his hands until dawn. And for the first time, he began to wonder if the war he'd been fighting had never been about soldiers at all, but about hearts, and who would manage to keep theirs intact. 3 days passed before Dieter saw the children again. He found them outside the infirmary, sitting beneath a palm tree with their new American caretaker, a nurse with hair tucked under her cap and a smile that came easily. The boy's arm was healing. The girl was learning English words one at a time, bread doll, son. When she saw Dieter, she ran to him, clutching her gauze doll like a treasure. He knelt down, and for a brief second, all the noise of the camp faded, the shouts, the trucks, the endless hum of engines. You're all right, he said softly, though she couldn't understand the words. Franz joined him a moment later, pretending he was only curious. But when the boy offered him half a biscuit, he took it without hesitation. Inside the infirmary, the nurse and a doctor worked side by side, one German, one American, changing bandages on wounded men from both armies. The sight struck Dieter silent. For months, the only world he'd known was divided into enemies and allies, but here, even blood lost its allegiance. That evening, as the sun fell into the sea, the Americans held a brief service for the wounded. No flags, no salutes, just quiet words about peace, about homes waiting somewhere far away. A chaplain prayed, and even those who didn't understand the language bowed their heads. When the prayer ended, Miller appeared again, dusty, tired, smiling. He'd come north with another convoy. Didn't think I'd see you boys again, he said, patting Dieter's shoulder. Dieter didn't have words, only gratitude. He handed back the note, but Miller shook his head. Keep it, he said. Someday you'll need to remember what it felt like here. A week later, the war ended. The news came through the camp loud and uncertain. The Reich had fallen, the fighting was over. Some prisoners cheered. Others wept. For Franz, it was disbelief. For Dieter, it was relief that didn't quite know where to go. The Americans began preparations to send them home. The children would be taken to an orphan center. Before they left, Dieter found the girl by the gate. She held out her gauze doll, her lucky charm. He tried to give it back, but she shook her head. For you, she said in broken English. Franz muttered, You'll never see them again. Dieter watched the truck carrying them roll down the dirt road until it vanished into the heat haze. Then he finally answered, Maybe not. But I'll remember them. When it was his turn to leave, he climbed into the transport and looked back one last time. The camp stretched into the distance, the same place where he'd expected punishment, and found kindness instead. As the truck rumbled toward the docks, he pulled Miller's note from his pocket. The paper was worn, the edges frayed, but the words were still clear. You're not what they said you were. He folded it carefully, tucking it into his jacket. For the first time in years, he believed it might be true. And as the ocean wind brushed his face, Dieter thought not of flags or victories, but of two children laughing in the back of a truck, of coffee shared between enemies, and of how a single act of mercy could outlast any war. Because in the end, the battle that mattered most wasn't the one fought with guns, but the one fought quietly, in the human heart.